The twisted metal of Kethver's fighter craft groaned as flames licked at the wreckage. Black smoke poured from the engine compartment, mixing with the thin atmosphere of the barren moon. He could taste copper and burnt circuits in the air as he pulled himself through the shattered cockpit window. His massive reptilian frame barely fitting through the opening, pain shot through his left shoulder, where a piece of shrapnel had punched through his armor plating. Green blood, thick as tree sap, oozed from the wound and dripped onto the rocky ground below. His scaled hide, normally a source of pride among his warrior clan, now bore the scars of defeat. Deep gashes ran across his chest and arms, each one a reminder of how the hive drones had torn through their formation like hungry predators. Kethver's yellow eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. The moon's surface stretched endlessly in all directions. Nothing but jagged rocks and dust storms. No cover, no escape. It's just the perfect place to die alone. Forgotten by the galaxy that had already written off his species as expendable mercenaries. Comm unit crackled with static, then fell silent. The rest of his squadron was either dead or scattered across the star system. The hive had hit them hard and fast, their black ships pouring out of hyperspace like a plague of locusts. Within minutes, dozens of Sorak fighters had been reduced to burning debris. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 centuries, his people had hired themselves out as the galaxy's most feared warriors. They fought for whoever paid the highest price, crushing rebellions and conquering worlds for the highest bidder. Other species whispered their name in terror. Children of a dozen worlds had nightmares about Sarok claws and fangs. Now, here he was, bleeding out on a forgotten moon, waiting for death to claim him like any other broken soldier. The distant rumble of engines made him freeze, his razor sharp. Hearing picked up the sound before his eyes could spot the source. Multiple craft, approaching fast from the eastern ridge. Kethver's clawed hand tightened around his plasma rifle, checking the power cell. Still half-charged, enough to take a few enemies with him when they came. He'd heard the stories about what the hive did to prisoners. Better to die fighting than become another host for their parasitic spawn. His finger found the trigger as the first ship crested. The ridge, its hull, gleaming silver against the pale sky. But something was wrong. The ship's design was all curved lines and smooth surfaces, completely different from the angular, bone-like architecture of high vessels. The engines hummed with a musical quality that seemed almost organic, unlike the harsh screech of insectoid technology. Contact on the ground. The voice that crackled over external speakers was young, excited, and completely alien to Kethver's experience. Not the chittering screech of the hive, not the deep growls of his own people, but something ... softer. I see movement by the crash site. The landing craft touched down about 50 meters away, its engines kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Kethver kept his weapon trained on the exit ramp as it lowered with a hydraulic hiss. The first figure to emerge was small by galactic standards, barely reaching Kethver's chest even with the bulky environmental suit. Over here, I found one. The figure waved toward the other ships, pulling off their helmet to reveal features that Kethver had only seen in intelligence briefings. Smooth skin, dark hair matted with sweat, and eyes that seemed to hold genuine concern rather than the calculating coldness he expected from potential captors. A human. The galaxy's newest species, barely a few centuries since they'd achieved faster-than-light travel. Weak, fragile beings who had somehow managed to carve out a small corner of space for themselves, despite lacking the natural weapons, armor, or size that every other successful species possessed. "Stay back, human," Kethver snarled, his voice a deep rumble that had intimidated countless enemies. His fangs gleamed as he spoke, each one sharp enough to tear through steel. "I am Sarok. We do not accept charity from the weak." The human whose name patch read Jinho raised both hands in a gesture of peace, but didn't back away. "Easy there, big guy. We're not here to fight. We're here to help." "Help." Kethver's laugh was a harsh bark. "Your species barely knows how to help itself. What could you possibly offer a warrior of the Sorak Empire?" A second figure emerged from the landing craft, this one carrying medical supplies, female with kind eyes that seemed to see straight. Through his aggressive posture to the pain beneath, her name patch-read Sora, and she moved with the confident precision of someone who had dealt with injured combatants before. "You're bleeding badly," she said, ignoring his raised weapon. As she knelt beside him, "That shoulder wound is deep. If we don't treat it soon, you'll go into shock." I said, "Stay back." Kethfer's voice rose to a roar, but Sora was already unpacking her medical kit. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, selecting bandages, an antiseptic without even looking at his threatening posture. "Your species has a reputation," said a third voice, calm and measured. The squad leader, a man called Hyanwu, stepped down from the ramp with the easy confidence of someone who had seen too many battles to be intimidated by threats. "Fierce fighters, honor-bound warriors, never surrender. Just another survivor. The Hive doesn't care what species we are when they're killing us." Kethfer felt the fight drain out of him as Sora's gentle touch cleaned his wounds. The medical patch she applied immediately began numbing the pain, and the bleeding slowed to a trickle. In his entire life, no one had ever treated him with such care. Sarak culture valued strength above all else. The wounded were left to heal themselves or die trying. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why help me?" "Because that's what people do," Jinho replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "They help each other." The transport ship's interior was cramped but functional, designed for rescuing survivors rather than carrying cargo. Kethfer found himself strapped into a seat designed for beings much smaller than himself, his massive frame taking up space. Meant for 3 humans, but none of his rescuers complained. They simply adjusted their seating arrangements and made room. As they lifted off from the moon's surface, Kethfer caught his first glimpse of the Coalition base through the viewport. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Ships of dozens of different designs orbited a massive space station, their varied architectures creating a patchwork of technologies and cultures. Some vessels were sleek and elegant, others bulky and industrial. A few he recognized from intelligence reports, but many more were completely alien to him. "Welcome to Haven Station," Hyanwu said, following his gaze. "It's not much, but it's home to about 50,000 refugees from Hive-conquered worlds." 50,000. Kethfer couldn't hide his amazement. "How do you maintain order with so many different species?" "Carefully," Jinho replied with a grin, "and with lots of coffee." The docking bay was a controlled chaos of activity. Massive. Galaths, their rock-like skin gleaming under the artificial lights, worked alongside delicate Valinari, whose semi-transparent forms shimmered like mirages. Insectoid clicking tar scuttled across the ceiling, their multiple limbs allowing them to work in 3 dimensions, and everywhere, coordinating the impossible logistics of keeping natural enemies from killing each other, or humans. Kethfer watched in fascination as a human supervisor named Teho settled a dispute between 2 species that had been at war for over a millennium. The Burning Suns and Ice Walkers had been locked in a territorial conflict that had consumed entire star systems, yet here they were, working side by side to repair a damaged freighter. "How?" Kethfer asked as they disembarked. "How do you keep them from fighting?" "We give them something more important to fight for," Sora replied, shouldering her medical kit. "Survival has a way of putting old grudges into perspective." But Kethfer suspected there was more to it than that. As they walked through the station's corridors, he observed the humans more carefully. They moved among the various species with an ease that suggested deep understanding rather than mere tolerance. They spoke multiple languages, understood different cultural customs, and seemed to instinctively know how to communicate with beings whose thought processes were completely alien to their own. In the medical bay, he watched a human doctor named Wujin treat a wounded Christic who's silicon-based. Its biology required completely different medical procedures than carbon-based life forms. The doctor's movements were precise and confident, showing the kind of expertise that came from years of dedicated study. "Your people learn quickly," Kethfer observed. "We have to," Wujin replied, without looking up from his patient. A galaxy full of different species. Adaptation isn't just useful, it's essential. Over the following days, as his wounds healed and his strength returned, Kethver found himself drawn into the daily life of the station. He expected to be treated as a dangerous outsider, watched and guarded at all times. Instead, he was given quarters, assigned duties, invited to participate in the community as if he belonged there. The humans, he realized, operated by rules that made no sense according to traditional galactic politics. They didn't seek to dominate or exploit the other species. They didn't demand tribute or submission. Instead, they simply worked to ensure that everyone had what they needed to survive and contribute. It was a radical concept that challenged everything Kethver thought he knew about power and strength. In a universe where survival had always demanded ruthless pragmatism, these fragile humans seemed to operate by entirely different principles, and somehow, impossibly, it was working. 3 days had passed since Kethver's rescue. Each hour spent on Haven Station only made him more confused about these strange humans. He found himself watching them like a predator, studying potential prey, trying to understand their tactics, their weaknesses, their hidden agenda. But the more he observed, the less sense they made. His morning routine had become a careful study of human behavior. He would position himself in the central plaza during meal distribution, watching the interactions between species with the sharp attention of a military strategist. The humans moved through the crowd with practiced ease, managing supplies, settling disputes, and somehow keeping thousands of different beings from tearing each other apart. On this particular morning, something caught his attention that made his blood run cold. A human engineer named Taman was distributing protein rations to the injured when a wounded Christic approached the line. The silicon-based alien's translucent body flickered weakly, clear signs of severe energy depletion. But what shocked Kethver wasn't the creature's condition, was the human's response. Without hesitation, Taman split his own ration packet in half and handed the larger portion to the Christic. The alien's crystalline structure immediately began to glow brighter as it absorbed the nutrients. But Kethver could only stare in disbelief. "Are you insane?" Kethver approached the human, his voice a low growl. "Do you know what that creature?" As Taman looked up, his face showing genuine confusion. "He's injured. He needs it more than I do. His people kept yours as cattle." Kethver's claws scraped against the metal floor as his anger rose. For 200 years, the Christic Empire used humans as slave labor in their mining operations. They worked your people to death in conditions that would kill most species. Where is your sense of justice? The human's expression grew thoughtful, but not angry. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, right? Kethver's voice rose to a roar that made several nearby aliens step back. Right would be letting that creature starve. Right would be making them pay for what they did to your people. Maybe, Taman admitted, securing his half ration in his pack. But if I let hatred control my actions, how am I different from the people who hurt us? Besides, that particular Christic over there, his name is Silkar. He spent 15 years fighting to free human slaves before his own people branded him a traitor. He's not our enemy. Kethver watched the engineer walk away, his mind reeling. In Saurak culture, such mercy would be seen as weakness, possibly even madness. His people had a saying, "The strong devour the weak, and the weak deserve to be devoured." It was the natural order of things, the way the galaxy had always worked. But these humans seemed to operate by completely different rules. That afternoon, his confusion deepened when he witnessed something that should have been impossible. A group of Saurak warriors, recently rescued from a hive prison ship, had cornered a human maintenance worker near the reactor core. Kethver recognized the lead warrior Gerthak, a veteran of the Saurak's brutal campaigns against the Valinari. The big reptilian's claws were extended, and his posture screamed violence. "You will fix our equipment first," soft-flesh Gerthak snarled, his fangs gleaming under the artificial lights. "We are warriors. You need our weapons before you waste time on your pathetic life support systems." The human, a small woman named Yunji, who couldn't have weighed more than 60 kilograms, stood her ground. She barely reached Gerthak's chest, and her only tools were a datapad and a plasma wrench. By every measure that mattered in the galaxy, she was helpless. The environmental systems serve everyone, she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. I won't let people die of suffocation because you want bigger guns. Gurthok's roar of rage echoed through the corridor. You dare refuse a Sarok warrior? We have killed entire armies. We have burned worlds. You are nothing but prey. Maybe, Yunji said, not backing down an inch. But I'm prey with a job to do. The atmospheric processors are failing in sectors 12 through 15. If I don't fix them in the next 4 hours, 2,000 people will start suffocating. Your weapons can wait. The confrontation was about to turn violent when Kethfer found himself stepping between them. He moved without thinking, his own massive frame blocking Gurthok's path to the human. She speaks truth, Gurthok, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a veteran warrior. Our weapons mean nothing if we cannot breathe. The other Sarok warrior's eyes widened in disbelief. You defend this weak human? Have you forgotten your pride? Your honor? Your very nature as a predator? I have forgotten nothing, Kethfer replied, his own claws emerging with a metallic scraping sound. But I have learned something new. Sometimes, the strongest choice is not the most obvious one. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds before Gurthok finally backed down. But as he retreated, his parting words cut deep. You have been infected by their weakness, Kethfer. You are no longer Sarok. That evening, as Kethfer tried to make sense of his actions, the station's alarm suddenly blared throughout the base. The harsh, urgent tone meant only one thing: enemy contact. The hive had found them. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as beings of dozens of species ran to battle stations. Kethfer grabbed his plasma rifle and rushed toward the defensive. Positions, his warrior instincts taking over. This was familiar territory: combat, violence, survival. This he understood, but as he took his position on the defensive line, he realized he was about to witness something that would shatter every assumption he'd held about human nature. The first wave of hive attackers crashed against the station's outer defenses like a tsunami of living darkness. Thousands of insectoid drones, their carapaces gleaming with biomechanical enhancements, swarmed toward the station in perfect formation. Their screams filled the void, a sound that had haunted the nightmares of every spacefaring species for decades. She had died for beings she'd never met, whose names she'd never learned, whose species had once considered humans to be inferior. She had died for the simple belief that every life mattered, even if that life would never know her name. The evacuation succeeded, Ji-hoon said quietly, watching Kethfer's reaction. 50,000 refugees escaped that day. 15 different species, including about 200 young Sarok. They're alive because people like Janae believed their lives were worth saving. Kethfer felt something crack inside his chest. His life, he had been taught that strength came from domination, that survival required the elimination of the weak. It was the natural order of things, the way the galaxy had always worked. The strong consumed the weak, and the weak deserved their fate. But watching that footage, seeing the face of the woman who had died for his nephew's children, he began to understand that there were different kinds of strength. The kind that conquered and the kind that endured. The kind that destroyed and the kind that preserved. The kind that took and the kind that gave. Your people are insane, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe, Ji-hoon replied with a sad smile. But we're the kind of insane. That makes the galaxy a better place. For the first time in his life, Kethfer began to understand that humanity had chosen the harder path. Not the path of conquest or domination, but the path of hope. It was more dangerous, more costly, more likely to end in failure and heartbreak. But it was also the path that led to something greater than survival. It led to a future worth fighting. For as he stood there in the command center, surrounded by the aftermath of battle and the weight of sacrifice, Kethfer realized that he was beginning to suspect something that would change everything he thought he knew about power. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their unshakable belief that every life mattered, even when that belief led them to their deaths. And somehow, impossibly, That belief was becoming contagious. He was beginning to suspect that humanity had chosen the harder path, that it might be the more powerful one. The proximity alarm screamed through Haven Station like the wail of dying gods. Kethver had heard that sound before. It meant death was coming, and there was nowhere to run. He rushed to the observation deck, his clawed feet scraping against the metal flooring as emergency lights bathed everything in hellish red. What he saw through the reinforced viewport made his warrior's heart sink into his stomach. The Hive fleet stretched across space like a living nightmare. Thousands upon thousands of biomechanical ships, their black holes pulsing with organic veins that glowed sickly green. The smallest vessels were the size of cruisers, bristling with weapon pods that looked like insect mandibles. The largest, dreadnoughts were floating cities of death, their surfaces crawling with smaller craft like parasites on some cosmic beast. "Sweet ancestors," whispered a Valinari beside him, its translucent form flickering with terror. "There must be 3,000 ships out there." Kethver's tactical mind automatically began counting, categorizing, analyzing. Fighter squadrons numbering in the tens of thousands, heavy cruisers that could crack planets, dreadnoughts capable of sterilizing entire star systems. Against this armada, Coalition's ragtag fleet of barely 200 vessels looked like toys floating in a bathtub. Panic spread through the station like wildfire. He watched as the fragile unity they had built over weeks began to crumble. In real time, the Christic delegation was already demanding immediate evacuation, their silicon-based forms crackling with nervous energy. Through the viewports, he could see Goliath ships powering up their engines, preparing to flee or make one final futile charge. Even his own people were losing their nerve. He spotted Gerthic and several other Sirach warriors heading toward the docking bays, muttering about honorable death and dying with dignity. The ancient warrior code demanded they face impossible odds with courage, but it also recognized when a battle was truly hopeless. But the humans responded differently. All senior staff to the command center. Jihoon's voice cut through the chaos on the communication network. What struck Kethver wasn't just the words, but the tone calm, steady, unshakable, as if facing certain annihilation was just another item on the day's schedule. Kethver found himself following the crowd toward the command center, his mind reeling. He had seen humans under pressure before, but this was different. They weren't panicking, weren't crying, weren't preparing for glorious last stands. They were walking to a meeting. The command center was packed with beings from dozens of species, all talking at once, in a babel of languages and clicking sounds. But when Jihoon stepped up to the central holotable, the room fell silent. "We can't outfight them," began Lieutenant Nari, the Coalition's tactical officer. She was young a human, barely out of her 20s, but her voice carried absolute confidence. 3,000 ships against 200? Those aren't odds, that's a massacre. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several aliens began edging toward the exits. "But we don't have to outfight them," Nari continued, and something in her tone made everyone freeze. "We just need to outthink them." The holographic display came alive, showing a three-dimensional map of the approaching Hive fleet. But instead of focusing on the enemy's overwhelming firepower, Nari began highlighting weaknesses, gaps in their formation. Predictable movement patterns, the rigid hierarchy that made the Hive both powerful and vulnerable. "The Hive operates like a single organism," explained Engineer Donghayan, stepping up beside her. "Perfect coordination, but zero adaptability. They've never faced anything like us, because nothing like us has ever existed." Kethver leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Look around this room," Donghan gestured to the assembled crowd. Christic engineers whose mathematical precision can calculate quantum fluctuations to 17 decimal places, Valinari pilots who can phase shift through solid matter, Goliath warriors who can survive direct hits from plasma cannons, Sorok fighters with reflexes faster than most computers. The engineer's eyes gleamed with something that looked dangerously like excitement. Separately, we're good. Together, we're something the universe has never seen before. On the display, a battle plan began to take shape, not the desperate charge Kethver expected, but something far more complex and audacious. using the unique abilities of each species in perfect coordination. They would create a weapon unlike anything the Hive had ever encountered. The Valenary can phase shift our smallest ships through the Hive's shields, Donghan explained, his fingers dancing over the holographic controls. While they're inside the enemy formation, Christic engineers can overload their power cores in precise patterns, not to destroy individual ships, but to create cascade failures throughout their network. A Goliath commander, his rock-like features carved into a frown, rumbled his objection. The electromagnetic pulses from those overloads will fry every unshielded system in the area. Our people will be flying blind. Not your people, Nari replied, with a grin. Goliath nervous systems are naturally resistant to electromagnetic interference. You can function when everyone else is paralyzed, and the soar okay. She looked directly at Kethver. Can lead the assault with their unmatched combat instincts, striking at the exact moment when the enemy is most vulnerable. The room erupted in discussions, some excited, some skeptical, all animated. Kethver found himself studying the plan with professional interest. It was insane, certainly. The coordination required would be unprecedented. The timing would have to be perfect. A single mistake would doom them all, but it might actually work. And what do humans contribute to this madness? Asked Gerthok, his voice dripping with familiar skepticism. Your people have no special abilities, no unique advantages. What can you possibly add to this desperate gamble? Jehoon's response was simple, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. Hold it all together. Over the next 6 hours, Kethver witnessed something that defied every principle of military organization he'd ever learned. The command center became a hive of activity as representatives from each species worked to integrate their capabilities into a single, coordinated assault plan. Under normal circumstances, such cooperation would be impossible. The Christek's mathematical approach to warfare clashed fundamentally with Sarok instinct-based tactics. Goliath engineers preferred brute force solutions that made delicate Valenary cringe. And everyone had historical grievances against everyone else, but the humans moved among them like master diplomats, finding common ground where none should exist. When Christic engineers balked at working alongside Goliath mechanics, it was Corporal Minho who found their shared love of precision and used it to bridge the gap. When Valenary pilots expressed doubt about trusting Sorok gunners with their lives, it was Captain So Young who reminded them of recent battles where such trust had already saved thousands. Kethver watched in fascination as ancient enemies began sharing technical specifications, tactical doctrines, even cultural insights that might prove useful in battle. A Christic mathematician worked side by side with a Sarak warrior to calculate optimal firing solutions. A Goliath engineer collaborated with a Valenary technician to modify shield harmonics, and through it all, humans provided something that couldn't be quantified or programmed hope. They moved through the chaos with unshakable confidence, their very presence suggesting that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. As the Hive fleet closed to weapons range, Kethver found himself assigned to a mixed crew aboard the human frigate Determination. His gunners included a young Christic named Zixtel, whose crystalline structure flickered with nervous energy. A Goliath warrior called Stoneheart, whose massive frame barely fit in the weapons bay. And a Valenary phase shifter, whose true name was a series of harmonic frequencies that hurt to hear. Under any other circumstances, such a crew would have dissolved into violence within minutes. Christic and Goliath had been at war for centuries. Sarok considered Valenary to be weak prey, and all of them had reasons to distrust the others. But as the human helmsman, Petty Officer Jae Soong, called out targeting coordinates with calm professionalism, something extraordinary happened. The crew began to function as a single organism, each member's unique abilities perfectly complementing the others. Zixtel's mathematical precision calculated firing solutions that accounted for quantum uncertainties. Stoneheart's massive strength allowed him to operate weapons that would have crushed smaller beings. The Valenary ethereal senses detected enemy movements through dimensions that normal Kethers couldn't perceive, and Kethver found himself coordinating their efforts with an intuitive understanding that surprised even him. His centuries of combat experience allowed him to read the battle's flow, to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate responses in real time. "All ships, this is Commander Ji-hoon," came the voice over the communication network as the Hive Fleet entered weapons range. The massive enemy formation blotted out the stars, a wall of death and destruction that seemed utterly unstoppable. "Today we don't fight as separate species," Ji-hoon continued, his words carrying to every ship in their desperate fleet. "Today, we fight as one people, united by our shared belief that every life has value, every voice deserves to be heard, and every future deserves to be protected." Kethfer gripped his weapons console and realized something that shook him to his core. He was no longer fighting for the coalition, or even for survival. He was fighting for something far more powerful, the dream of a universe where strength came not from domination, but from unity. The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment the galaxy learned what humans truly brought to the cosmos. Not superior weapons or overwhelming numbers, but the unprecedented power of hope made manifest through absolute trust. The silence after victory was different from the silence after defeat. Kethfer had experienced both many times in his long military career, but this felt entirely new. There was no bitter taste of failure, no hollow satisfaction of conquest. Instead, there was something he had never felt before, a sense of profound completion, as if the universe had shifted into a better alignment. The debris field stretched for thousands of kilometers in all directions. Twisted hulks of hive ships drifted like dead whales in the void, their biomechanical systems finally still after centuries of relentless hunger. Some of the larger dreadnoughts were still mostly intact, their massive forms now serving as monuments to what could be accomplished when the impossible became inevitable. But what amazed Kethfer most wasn't the destruction, it was what hadn't been destroyed. The Coalition fleet, battered but unbroken, moved through the wreckage like living proof that miracles could happen. Ships from dozens of species flew in perfect formation, their crews working together with an efficiency that defied every law of galactic politics he'd ever known. The battle itself had been unlike anything in recorded history. When the final assault began, Kethfer had watched 3,000 hive ships suddenly find themselves fighting not 200 separate vessels, but a single, coordinated organism that attacked from 17 different dimensions simultaneously. Valinary. Fighters had phase-shifted directly through hive shields, appearing inside enemy formations like deadly ghosts. Futuristic engineers had triggered cascade overloads that rippled through the enemy fleet like a virus, turning the hive's own interconnectedness against them. Goliath heavy cruisers had absorbed massive electromagnetic pulses that would have crippled any other species, then emerged from the chaos to deliver devastating broths. And the Saraka's own people had led the final charge with a ferocity that even the hive couldn't match. But it wasn't the mindless aggression of their mercenary past. It was focused, coordinated, part of something larger than themselves. Through it all, human voices had provided the unifying rhythm that kept the impossible symphony playing in perfect harmony. No single human ship had delivered the killing blow. No human weapon had been the deciding factor. Instead, they had done something far more powerful. They had made everyone else better than they ever thought possible. Kethfer found Commander Ji-hoon on the observation deck of the flagship, staring out at the debris field, where the greatest hive armada in history had been reduced to scrap metal and cooling biomatter. The human leader bore fresh scars from the battle, a plasma burn along his left cheek, bandages covering wounds on his hands from when he'd personally helped repair a damaged console during the fight, but his eyes held something Kethfer had never seen before in any military commander. Not the grim satisfaction of a warrior who had defeated his enemies, not the hollow exhaustion that came after massive casualties. Instead, there was a quiet peace, the expression of someone who had helped his friends discover their true potential. "Other species leaders are requesting permission to depart," Kethfer reported, moving to stand beside the human. "They wish to return to their homeworlds with news of the victory. The Futuristic High Council wants to share our tactical innovations. The Goliath clans are eager to tell their people about the alliance. Even my own Sarak commanders speak of bringing this new way of fighting to the Empire." Kuhn nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Of course. They have their own people to protect, their own rebuilding to do. The galaxy is bigger than just our little coalition. And yet Kethfer continued. Many of the individual crew members have asked to remain. They want to continue serving in mixed crews, to be part of something larger than their own species. That young Christic on my gun crew, Zixtal Hayes requested. Permanent assignment to human ships. Says he's learned more about warfare in the past week than in 50 years of traditional Christic military service. For the first time in days, Gihun smiled, not the careful diplomatic expression he wore during meetings, but something genuine and warm. That doesn't surprise me. They've tasted what we can accomplish together. It's hard to go back to fighting alone after that. Kethfer moved to stand beside the human commander, his massive reptilian frame dwarfing the smaller being. But somehow he no longer felt like the dominant presence in the room. I spent 2 centuries as a warrior, believing that strength came from domination, that survival required the elimination of the weak. The Sirach Empire taught me that the universe was a place where only the strongest deserved to live. He paused, watching a mixed crew of humans and aliens working together to salvage useful technology from a destroyed hive cruiser. But watching your species over these past weeks, I realize I understood nothing about true power. We're not more powerful than you, Ji-hoon replied quietly. Single human couldn't defeat a single Sorok in combat. Our technology isn't superior to Christic science or Goliath engineering. We're just powerful in a different way. Yes, Kethfer agreed, his voice carrying a note of wonder that surprised him. Your strength doesn't come from your weapons or your numbers or your individual capabilities. It comes from your ability to see potential where others see only differences. To inspire hope where others see only despair. You turn enemies into allies, fear into courage, desperation into determination. In the months that followed, Kethfer remained with the human fleet, no longer as a rescued refugee or even as a military ally, but as part of something unprecedented in galactic history. He watched the birth of the first truly integrated force. In known space, where species distinctions mattered less than shared purpose and mutual respect, he served under human commanders like Captain Wu Jin, who led crews of 20 different species with the same easy competence she showed leading her own kind. During their first joint mission, helping to evacuate a Valenary colony threatened by stellar collapse, he watched her coordinate rescue efforts that involved delicate phase-shifting techniques, massive Goliath cargo haulers, and precision Christic calculations, all while maintaining the kind of calm leadership that made the impossible seem routine. He witnessed, engineered the Gin solve impossible technical problems by combining technologies that had never been used together before. When their ship's quantum drive failed in deep space, she had worked with a Christic mathematician and a Goliath metallurgist to create a completely new type of engine using salvaged parts from 3 different civilizations. The innovation didn't just get them home, it revolutionized faster-than-light travel for everyone. He saw Dr. Kunjo treat wounded warriors with the same compassion regardless of whether they were human, Sirach, or something else entirely. When Kethfer himself was injured during a boarding action against hive remnants, the human medic had worked for 18 straight hours to save his life. Using techniques adapted from Christic crystal healing and Valenary energy manipulation, and gradually, through hundreds of small interactions and shared experiences, he began to understand the true nature of the power humanity brought to the galaxy. It wasn't conquest or domination. It wasn't superior technology or overwhelming force. It was something far more dangerous and transformative, the simple belief that every sentient being had value, that cooperation was stronger than competition, that the future could be better than the past. In his final personal log entry, recorded as the fleet prepared to establish the first truly integrated colony in galactic history, Kethfer spoke words that would later be carved into the monument at the colony's heart. I have fought beside the most feared monsters in the galaxy, beings of incredible strength, devastating weaponry, and ruthless efficiency. I have served with warriors who could crush planets and engineers who could build stars. But humanity showed me that true power lies not in the strength to destroy, but in the courage to unite. Not in the ability to dominate, but in the wisdom to inspire. Not in the fear one can instill, but in the hope one can kindle. The humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the most technologically advanced. They are not the oldest civilization or the most numerous, but they possess something far more valuable than any of these advantages: the unshakable belief that every sentient being has worth, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that every future deserves to be protected. In a universe filled with monsters, humanity's greatest strength is their refusal to become one. As the colony ships prepared to depart for their new homeworld, where beings from 50 different species would build something that had never existed before, Kethfer stood beside his human friends and colleagues. He was no longer an observer, but a participant in something that would reshape the galaxy forever. He had learned that there were different kinds of strength, and that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't the ability to conquer, but the courage to believe in something greater than oneself. The age of isolation was ending. The age of unity had begun, and it had started with a single human voice saying, "Let me help." The end.